I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as top diplomat Kaja Kallas claims the EU will be ready to step into the breach if the US withdraws support for Ukraine, we discuss the latest weapon donations at Ramstein and include a dispatch from Kyiv at a drone workshop.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 10th of January, 2 years and 315 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by The Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, and our Executive Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley. First to Dom for the latest from the battlefield.
So let's start on the ground. Kursk, more ground reclaimed by Russia in the northwest sector of the Ukrainian lodgement there, but not a huge amount, and virtually no other movement across the rest of the front line through the country. However, that does in no way mean it was quiet. Russian forces launched 72 drones at Ukraine overnight from the Russian cities of Bryansk and Orel, that's to the north of Ukraine, also from Milarovo to the east, and from Primorsk-Akhtarsk to the southeast. That comes from Ukraine's Air Force. Now, of the 72, 33 were shot down over the following oblasts: Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk, Cherkasy, Zaporizhia, Khmelnytsky, Kherson and Mykolaiv. Basically all of Ukraine except for the very far west and the northwest. 34 drones were lost to EW. Regional authorities say that 3 civilians have been killed, 19 injured. Now, yesterday we talked about the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, to give it its formal title, the Ramstein Group, also named. It was started off at the US Air Base in Ramstein, Germany. German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius was asked about the potential for a US withdrawal from the process, or what's going to happen to the Ukraine Defence Contact Group after the 20th of January with Trump coming in. He said, if those in the United States now decide not to maintain this format any longer, then we will have to make our own decisions. Fairly obvious, but it sounds as if there's a desire to keep it going. Boris Pistorius added that it's too early to speculate about what may or may not happen after the 20th of January. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin similarly refused to play the guessing game. He said that's a decision for the next administration to make. I won't speculate on what direction they will go in. So all playing it very, very cagey. Now, you'll remember the US pledged an additional $500 million in aid yesterday. That takes, just to round this off, because it's the last time, well, almost certainly, but yes, it's the last time that we will see the Biden administration at the Ramstein process in whatever guise it continues. So just to round this off, Washington committed more than $63.5 billion worth in security assistance to Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. That latest tranche, as we said yesterday, includes air defense missiles, air-to-ground munitions, and lots of bits and pieces for F-16s. Now, also at Ramstein, Ukraine's Defence Minister Rustem Umerov, he said the group had approved, it's a bit wonkish, but he said it approved 8 roadmap documents that outline the Ukrainian forces' objectives for the next 2 years, covers key areas such as air defence, artillery, armoured vehicles, drones, the Air Force and maritime security as well. Mr. Umerov said the roadmaps aim to ensure that the Ukrainian military is compatible with NATO and they'll serve as the basis for the medium and long-term support for Ukraine. Okay, fine. That's all good. He's trying to keep up the momentum. You can't blame him for that. Of course, it's his job. Keep up the momentum in the absence of any hard NATO membership or offers of NATO membership now. He's trying to show a convergence with NATO standards and equipment and all that kind of stuff to make NATO membership easier in the future. I don't mean to sound, it's not negative when I say he's trying to show convergence. That is what they are trying to do. He's trying to do everything they can to push Ukraine closer to NATO membership. So yeah, eight roadmap documents. I mean, God, I remember that from the military. There'll all be traffic lights, red, amber and green for on progress or not, all the rest of it. It'd be an absolute nightmare for a staff officer to keep that under control. But that's why I'm no longer a staff officer. Anyway, as well as the US $500 million, there were other pledges yesterday. Germany promised more Iris-T air defence missiles, so we talk about them quite a lot. They are good, modern in the surface-launched medium-range variant. Anyway, Iris-T is infrared imaging system with tail/thrust vector controlled. So infrared imaging system, tail or thrust vector controlled. A family of short-range infrared homing air-to-air missiles took over from the Sidewinder that you may remember. It's also, in recent years, included the short to medium-range surface-to-air missiles. Now, Poland yesterday, the Polish minister said a new aid package will be coming shortly. No details on that. And then also, as we reported yesterday, the UK, Latvia, Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden are going to provide Ukraine with 30,000 drones in a package worth just over $55 million. All very good, all very welcome. But of course, the big fish in town, everyone's staring at January the 20th. Now then, yesterday, United Nations monitors visited the site of the Zaporizhia attack that occurred the day before, Wednesday. That attack that resulted in 13 civilians dead and 110 injured. The UN's Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine says that was the highest number of civilian casualties in a single incident in almost 2 years. They said it marks the largest number of casualties they've recorded since a residential building in Dnipro city was hit on the 14th of January 2023, and the deadliest since a supermarket in Konstantinivka in Donetsk region was hit on the 9th of August last year. Now, I'm often very critical of the UN, as you'll know, when it comes to Ukraine, so I'm very happy to report when they do take action. So these monitors, they visited the site of the Zaporizhia attack, documenting damage, interviewed victims and witnesses. They say the attack took place in the afternoon, and in their words, when many workers at the facility were leaving at the end of their shift. They said many of the victims, both workers at the plant and passers-by, were killed or injured in the street or on public transportation. That obviously fits with the images that we saw. Now, Mission Chief Danielle Bell said glide bombs have become one of the greatest threats to people in cities along the front line. Ms. Bell said they are also one of the main reasons why the number of killed and injured in 2024 increased by 30% compared with 2023. Now, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, they put out a statement. They reminded the world that under international humanitarian law, an attacking party must take all feasible precautions to minimise civilian harm, and said Wednesday's attack had raised serious concerns in this regard. So Ms. Bell again, she said it was entirely foreseeable that using such weapons in a city during the day would result in significant civilian casualties. It is hard to see how this attack could be in compliance with the obligation to minimise civilian harm. Nice one, Ms. Bell. Now then, sticking with the UN, and a story that I missed from Wednesday this week, but covering it now. Speaking at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Nadia al-Nashif, the Deputy UN Human Rights Chief, denounced the spike in Russian executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. In language that couldn't be more blunt, quite frankly, Ms. al-Nashif said, "I call on the Russian authorities to halt the summary executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Summary executions constitute a war crime." Now, note, she didn't use the word, the big get out clause, alleged anywhere in that statement. It'll be interesting to see how Russia responds. Anyway, she told Russia to, quote, condemn such acts and to prosecute those responsible. The UN Rights Office, she said, had recorded 62 alleged executions of Ukrainian POWs in 19 separate incidents between September and November last year. Overall, since the start of the full-scale invasion, she said the UN had, quote, verified the execution of 68 Ukrainian service personnel captured by Russian armed forces, unquote. And in a statement, they also verified the summary execution of 170 civilians in Russia-controlled areas, including in places of detention. Ms. al-Nashif said accountability for these killings is essential. Instead, there is almost total impunity. Again, with a hat I don't often wear, I'm impressed with the UN today. Now, I should add, she also said Russian prisoners of war held by Ukraine had complained of being subject to torture and ill treatment. She said the Ukrainian abuse was not described as systematic, and had taken place mostly in places of transit before reaching official places of internment. She said, quote, "Our office has documented the death of one Russian prisoner of war and has raised these allegations with the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. I urge those in authority on both sides to take immediate steps to end the use of torture against prisoners of war and to prosecute those responsible." Now, I say that because it happened. She said it. It's there. It's news. It's in no way to draw an equivalence. There's a moral equivalence. There's nothing like a quantifiable equivalence, though. But I thought that was quite impressive by the UN there. And yes, this is Dominic speaking in London. Now, last one for me, Adélie. Norway is to resume construction of bomb shelters, citing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as evidence that they're needed in case of a worst-case scenario. This is reported by the NRK, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. They're reporting it today. Hat tip from me to the Kyiv Independent for reporting it. You'll find it on the NRK's website, and then I had to put it through some pretty laboured translation tool, but to basically have a look at the Kyiv Independent. It's got all the quotes there. Now, until 1998... any new large apartment building constructed in Norway were required to incorporate a bomb shelter in the design. But no new shelters have been built since then, since 1998. But now Norwegian Justice and Public Security Minister Emilie Mehl said, "There is more uncertainty around us. We must take care of the civilian population in the event of a worst-case scenario of war or armed attack. Shelters are one of the protective measures we need. We are now actually setting a requirement that buildings over 1,000 square metres must have shelters." Now, if you remember, when I was at the defence conference in Prague last November, a Swedish defence minister said that his country was doing likewise, starting to refurb old and build new bomb shelters. I offered the opinion at the time that talk of building bomb shelters would be met with disbelief and incredulity in this country. I'd be very interested to hear a British politician just make reference to these Norwegian and Swedish plans just to see how it would go down. Just on the subject, there was a debate yesterday in the House of Lords here in London on air defence capabilities. And Lord Coker, the government's defence minister in the Lords, he was asked a question. He said, "We're investing in new technologies, including the Dragonfire directed energy weapon to defeat threats such as drones, and enhancing our capabilities through the Type 45, that's a big Navy ship, Type 45's ability to defend against anti-ship ballistic missiles. Further development in IAMD, Integrated Air and Missile Defence, IAMD capability is being considered in conjunction with the Strategic Defence Review to ensure a coherent approach across defence and wider government." Right, so a bit wordy. Sounds like lots of things are happening. Really-ish. But when I look at that, it's good. But the Dragonfire directed energy weapon, that's still experimental. It's not yet a capability. It's not in service. It's still experimental. The Type 45... focusing on anti-ship missiles, as Lord Coker said. And also, as I said, it's a ship. It's a big floaty thing. So if there's a war, they wouldn't be hanging around London as they did in the Olympics. We had a Type 45 on the Thames for London 2012 for this, putting a bubble of air defence over London. But they wouldn't be there doing that. They'd be out hunting mermaids or doing whatever it is the Navy gets up to. Anyway, and as for the IAMD, the Integrated Air and Missile Defence, there is an ongoing NATO project along those lines at the moment. I'd love to produce a graphic with a nice big bubble over the whole of Western Europe, but that ain't where it is at the moment, and it's not stopped Russian drones landing, we should assume by accident, in Poland and Romania. So how capable is NATO's IAMD if push really did come to shove? But interesting debate there yesterday, Adélie. But as I say, I'd be very, very interested to hear a British politician opine on this more broadly, and particularly on the bomb shelters, just to see how it would be picked up by our colleagues in the press or in the commentariat, see if we in the UK, and I'd be interested in listeners' perspectives from their countries. How would a public discussion from the defence ministries about the need to build bomb shelters, how would that go down? Would that be prudent planning, or would it just be seen as crazy? Anyway, I'd be very interested. And that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom, for the updates. I would say if I were to hear we're building bomb shelters, I'd be quite baffled, although it is something that is required, for example, or used to be required in Switzerland as well. But over to Francis for the diplomatic updates.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. Us talking about bomb shelters takes me right back to Kharkiv, the three of us crammed in one with Jack trying to sleep under a piece of cardboard, using it as a DIY blackout blind. Such is the glamorous life of a foreign correspondent. But I also want to focus on Europe with punchy remarks from the EU's top new diplomat Kaja Kallas, saying that the EU would be ready to take the lead on supporting Ukraine if the US is not. She said, "I'm really sure that all the other members, and hopefully also the US, are ready to continue with the support of Ukraine. But the EU is also ready to take over this leadership if the US is not willing to. We shouldn't really speculate about future US support. In my view, it is not in the interest of America that Russia will be the strongest force in the world." Now, suffice to say, those comments contrast sharply with those of her predecessor, Josep Borrell, who said last year that Europe cannot fill the gap when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And I should say that that is, of course, the common view as things stand. Indeed, whilst I think Kallas is sincere in her belief that Brussels should fill any void, many will ask, with what? Europe, by which I mean European countries inside and outside the EU, have not been able to forge a persuasive defence posture independent of the United States. Much is still happening, and I'll come to that in a moment, but it remains unclear what its intention fundamentally is. We hear as long as it takes, but to do what? Victory for Ukraine? Doing enough to bring Russia to the negotiating table? It's never been clear. Now, in lieu of that strategic clarity, or indeed en masse mobilisation or ramping up of defence procurement, Europe has relied on its financial arsenal, which of course still matters. Ursula von der Leyen, still head of the Commission, has just released a statement saying that almost 3 years into Russia's war of aggression, Ukraine can keep counting on its friends and partners. Today we'll deliver €3 billion, the first payment of the EU part of the G7 loan, giving Ukraine the financial power to continue fighting for its freedom and prevail. Now, Dom just covered the top lines from the start of the Ramstein summit, and I thought it was interesting Zelensky is emphasising involving NATO members in purchasing Ukrainian weapons under that model pioneered by Denmark, which was, of course, the first country to offer to donate arms to Ukraine via direct purchases from the Ukrainian defence industry, because, of course, Kyiv's defence budget does not actually match the capabilities of its domestic weapons production. It's for that reason that Zelensky said if the $330 billion of Russian assets in the West were given to Ukraine, Kyiv would buy Western weapons from the US and other countries en masse. Now, at Ramstein, some more news for our Canadian listeners. The country has pledged $305 million in additional military assistance to Ukraine. It includes $138 million allocated to Czechia's initiative for procuring and delivering large caliber ammunition, adding to over $36 million pledged last year. I'll have some more thoughts on the Canadian position in my final thought later on. Now, as we all know, the German position on support for Ukraine has perhaps been the most contentious in the European context, and as we enter 2025, its beleaguered Chancellor Olaf Scholz has tried to position himself as the man who saved Europe from an escalatory spiral triggering a continent-wide war. And as part of that, he, of course, refused to give Taurus missiles and other munitions, saying he wanted to prioritise defensive technology instead. Well, that claim is being pulled apart today after Der Spiegel has broken a story alleging that his government has been debating additional military assistance beyond what it's given at Ramstein for weeks now, including predominantly defensive weapons for shooting down projectiles targeting energy infrastructure. So the full story is the Foreign Minister Baerbock from the Green Party, of course, and Defence Minister Boris Pistorius reportedly proposed allocating an additional $3 billion for providing Ukraine with critically needed weapons before the early elections on the 23rd of February. Now, this package reportedly included 3 additional IRST batteries with interceptor missiles, additional interceptors for Patriot systems, 10 self-propelled howitzers and artillery ammunition. However, it would appear that Scholz blocked it, with many claiming this is for electoral reasons as he seeks to pitch himself as the peacemaking chancellor. He's not alone in the EU, with his hesitancy, of course, with some going even further and condemning the notions of armament altogether. President Higgins of Ireland, its head of state, said this week, "It is important that we respond to the use of science and rhetoric that calls for war as a state of mind, including the recent appalling comments from NATO calling for ever more armaments spending to be achieved." Now, the uncertainty of the US position is the cause of so many of these discussions and the sense of urgency among other NATO members and indeed European countries. I reported yesterday how Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg had set himself the goal of trying to end the war within 100 days of the inauguration. And the Financial Times has dug deeper into the thinking of his advisors today. 2 European officials told them that discussions with Trump's incoming team in recent weeks revealed they had not yet decided on how to solve the conflict and that support to Ukraine would continue after the US president's inauguration on January 20th. He said the whole Trump team is obsessed with strength and looking strong, so they're recalibrating the Ukraine approach. That was one of the officials speaking to the FT. The incoming administration, they suggest, is also wary of comparisons being made with Biden's calamitous US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was something the Trump camp would not like to see repeated in Ukraine. Again, more evidence from the officials that they believe that past the 20th of January, the US will be perhaps more robust than some expect in its support of Ukraine. Now, that might be due to the fact that European leaders and officials have been making the case to Trump and his team that continued US military aid is needed to put Kyiv in a stronger position for peace talks and help bring Moscow to the negotiating table. French officials think strengthening Ukraine's position on the battlefield means stopping Russia's advances in the east of the country, because there would be no talks if Moscow was still taking territory. It would seem the Italians hold a similar view, with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who met Trump at his Mar-a-Lago resort last week, saying that she does not foresee a US disengagement. She said Trump may be someone who is moving forward towards a solution, but I don't think that means abandoning Ukraine. Security guarantees are fundamental, she said, if we actually aspire to have peace. We all know that in the past, Russia has violated the agreements that it has signed. I think she's referencing the Budapest Memorandum there and others, including Minsk. Without guarantees, we cannot have certainty that it will not happen again. Now, just since I mentioned the US, just a little tangent, US Border Patrol arrested a former Russian mercenary in recent days when he illegally crossed the Rio Grande near Roma. The man apparently waded across it carrying 2 passports, $4,000 and a drone. The assistant US attorney said he admitted when interviewed to being a member of the Wagner Group. A rather curious story causing a bit of a stir in the US. We will, of course, keep an eye on it. Now, in short, for many European countries who are less convinced Russia wants to negotiate, how to maintain Ukraine's resilience is the key question as we enter 2025. And for those who are interested in that, I just wanted to mention I'll be taking part in a panel discussion in Edinburgh next week, co-hosted by the Royal Institute of International Affairs, i.e. Chatham House, the US Embassy in the UK and the Scottish Council on Global Affairs. It will be chaired by Professor Luke March, who's the chair of post-Soviet and comparative politics at Edinburgh, the Scottish Parliament head of the cross-party group on Ukraine, Anna Kulish, the People's Deputy of Ukraine, Alexandra Ustinova, and a name that will be familiar to many listeners from our event at the US Embassy last year, Orysia Lutsievich OBE, who is the Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. And I'll add a link in the show notes for those who are interested in following that or attending, potentially even contributing at it. And lastly, and thanks to Dom for clocking this story, we mentioned several times this week increased concerns among the Joint Expeditionary Force group of countries about sabotage of vital undersea cables. Well, a Newsweek review of Chinese language patent applications shows that engineers in China invented devices to sever such cables quickly and cheaply in recent years. A quote, dragging-type submarine cable cutting device, they say, was developed in 2020 by a team of engineers at Lishu University, which is opposite Taiwan. Now, of course, no doubt other countries are developing this technology too, but we mention this here as this is the first time that I've certainly seen detailed diagrams of these devices and how they work, and would add a link in the show notes to those who are interested in that issue. But that's where we are, Adélie, with the major political stories of the past 24 hours.
Thanks, Francis. And now a dispatch from me from a drone workshop in Kyiv. During our last trip to Kyiv, I visited a small drone workshop. It was just two guys, Andrei and Sasha, both in their early 30s, in a basement room in the centre of the city. The room isn't very big. On one side, there's a welding station. On the other, there are shelves with piles of black drones on them. But more surprisingly, there are vases and flowers everywhere in the room. That's because Ksenia, the woman who created the workshop, used to be a florist before the war.
Right now she's no more a florist.
That's Ihor, the translator. You'll hear him throughout the interview.
But she still gets a lot of flowers. Is it to like keep...
It's birthday maybe 1 week ago. Ми фасували їжу і по Київській області колоною автівок роззиралися.
At the beginning of the war, when we just moved in this location, it was everything was just piled up with stuff. It was quite messy in here, and we just had to clear it up for this workshop to look like a workshop. Since I mentioned that at the beginning we were delivering medical aid and food all around the Kyiv region, but then we just changed our occupation and started focusing on the work that we are doing right now.
Okay, so tell me more about the drones then.
Почали ми десь приблизно весною цього року.
So basically we started dealing with drone production at the beginning of this year. It happened in spring, and we've got no financial support. This is why all of the procedure is taking too long. At the initial stage we fundraise for engines, for some other elements for the drone, so this is the reason why it takes some time for one drone to be produced.
And so what sort of drones are they? What do they do?
Два основних типа дронів. So
you can see here there are different types of drones. You can see 3 of them. They are differentiated by their sizes. So you can see the 7, 8 and 10 inches drones. Their size designates the amount of weight it can pick up, and then this amount is used to be dropped onto the Russians that came here on our land and occupying us. The drone that you see, these are kamikaze drones, so basically they are one-way drones. They just go there and basically attack the Russians. So
the
battery is placed on top of it.
And that would be like a bomb, and then they just like fly into the...
They just hit the target. So these are kamikaze drones. They don't drop the thing that should be exploded, but they just hit the target and they explode altogether.
So what Andrei is showing us right now is that the drone is basically like a black cross that's got a little like electronic component in the middle. The engine goes here? Yeah?
It's for engine. Вони обираються по... Там декілька є параметрів, але...
there are several parameters according to which we choose how to collect our drones. The first one, and one of the major ones, is the efficiency of its engine and the amount of weight it can pick up. So basically we've selected one of the best producers and basically suppliers. This is why our drones are quite good. Initially when we used AliExpress suppliers, so the drones were not that effective. They could fly just at the distance of not more than 3 kilometers, and right now our drones can fly as far as 36 kilometers. So everything, all of the components are quite important, and the way they are connected and assembled is really influences the efficiency of every drone. So right now, this is like the best option that we managed to get.
At the bottom, there's like a box that gets attached, and that's the explosive that the drone then flies into Russian troops or on the target.
Да, там просто ще ми робимо як шаблони.
So what we are creating is basically the basis of a drone. So every specific military unit is choosing what are the elements that should be added to every specific drone. So it could perform tasks specifically in a very specific area according to the tasks that are set by every specific military unit.
What's kind of like the output?
This is the second batch of drone that we managed to assemble. In total, the number of drones that we created reached 215 units. So you can see the name of the drone. This is basically the name that is given by the donator. So the person who is donating can choose an occupied city or the name of a deceased brother in arms or somebody else or something else. This sort of communication is used by us to raise more funds and for people to be more interested in donating. So this is the way how they can influence the war in a tiny way.
Okay, so people give you money being like, I want to fund 10 drones and they'll be called Spartacus.
The idea of naming the drones was invented by Ksenia. Basically, she is the one who asks every donator to choose the name for a drone.
And then you sell the drones to the military or you give the drones to the military?
Зараз поки ще саме віддаємо безкоштовно, тобто все.
No, we don't take any money for these drones. We give them to the soldiers for free. Of course, we have to pick up the military directions where these drones should be sent, depending on what is happening on the front line. So we cannot give like 100 drones to one specific military unit and give like 10 or 5 just to some other unit. So we are looking closely and following everything that is happening on the front line very closely to just make the right choices of the number of drones that can be sent to every specific direction.
Mm-hmm. And can the donors choose which unit or which area of the front they...
Так, якщо в них є, але зазвичай вони довіряють нам, бо вони вже не перший...
Yes, people who donate money can choose the military unit where they want this drone to be delivered to. But, you know, often they are relying on our own choice because we know who needs them the most.
And has the military provided you with feedback on how to make the drones better as you were setting up the workshop?
Ну, більше ми їх заставляємо, тому що з військових дуже...
Well, you know, to be honest with you, military guys are so hard to communicate with because they are always somewhere fighting and they're on the front line, so they cannot come back to us very often with the information that we require from them, but we push on them to give us some details on how we can make these drones better and more effective. For instance, recently we've received the information regarding the distance that these drones should be capable of flying, and Ksenia is asking them a lot of questions regarding these issues. And to thank us and to basically show us the results of the efficiency of these drones, military guys often send us some videos of how they operate them, and we got some videos of how these drones target the Russian infantry and tanks and other vehicles. But, you know, they don't do that right after the battle because this is not that safe. This is why they can send us these videos and footage only just after a while.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. I was just wondering because he'd mentioned about getting a better supplier for the motors, whether that was like a piece of feedback that had come from the military in like, oh, we need to make that part better.
Ну, саме в виробництві є такий етап після виробництва партії, як
So before the final production of every drone and before its delivery to the front line, we test it. We got some friends who can operate drones and they tell us what should be made better. Moreover, we have undertaken the training courses of drone assembling, and this is why we've got this information while studying and learning how to assemble the drones, so we know which is bad and which is good.
Якщо ви подивитесь саме на нашу, от, наприклад, пайка дуже важлива.
So this element in the electronics is one of the most important parts of the drone because these elements influence the functionality of every drone.
А якщо ви подивитесь на цей крокодил, з якого...
For instance, look at this yellow drone. It's not the best drone. One of the things that you have to pay attention to is the soldering right here. It's not that good. It's vibrating and it basically can spoil the functionality of the drone. Here you can see video transmitter. It's a very bad quality.
Відеопередавач цієї фірми АКК.
Once you look at our drone, you can see the soldering is really good here. This one is much better compared to this yellow one.
І ще з приводу взагалі запчастин. Тобто Rama
Speaking about the drones that we produced, almost every part of them is produced in Ukraine, which is very important. For instance, take a look at this frame. It is produced in the Lviv region. All of the electronics is produced in Ukraine as well. You can see the Trident here, produced in Ukraine. Speaking about the engines, the situation is just the same. All of them are produced in Ukraine. Video transmitters are also made in Ukraine. So our aim is to close this cycle to make it possible for these drones to be produced completely in Ukraine, to fill our budget and to create workplaces. So this is also important for the military, because if these drones are completely produced in Ukraine, it's making the production much quicker. So the militaries at the front line can get these drones much faster.
So we've moved across the room to the desk where Sasha is building a drone. So I think he's welding.
Зараз він камеру припаює, він трошки дороблює дрон, який був на 7 дюймів.
So right now he is welding a camera.
So he's attaching the camera at the front of the drone to the electronic component chip, right? So it's a very fine job. There's a very tiny electronic cables to the electronic chip.
So basically there are two chips. The controller that is controlling the direction where the drone is flying is attached on the upper part of this drone, and the lower chip is used for attaching the camera transmitter, and elements that control engines.
І через антени, відеоантенну і...
We can see there is antenna attached as well, so the signal is transmitted there, and with this antenna we can see what the drone actually sees. The next step after the welding is to clear the welding elements for them to transmit a signal better.
Okay, so that's what we just heard. Sasha just took a toothbrush into some sort of liquid solution and brushed the electronic chip. So that was to clean it so it would transmit better.
Да, дуже важливо, щоб між контактами, оцими всіми кульками, як ми їх називаємо, не було...
You see these tiny contacts on the chip. Each of them should be separated from each other for a better contact. So this is really important. This is why we clear this tiny space between every contact.
Це відповідно до самої зборки дрона, тому що на тих же запчастинах...
Our approach to drone production is very meticulous, so we are trying to do it as high quality as possible. We're starting with the contacts and with this clearing of every contact to the cable and the way they are attached. For instance, in this drone, you can see that the conditioner cannot be attached close to the cooler because it's going to be overheated. In the yellow drone that you've just seen, the situation is just like this. They are attached very close to each other, and this is why the drone is not that functional.
How long does it take to build a drone?
Скільки часу вам треба для виробництва одного дрона?
Якщо зі зборкою рами, то приблизно години-дві, але зараз ми це розбили на етапи.
In average, to assemble one drone takes up to 2 hours, but we don't do this like this in the ordinary way because, we've got these elements delivered to us in batches. For instance, we've got frames assembled already, and once we got engines delivered, we just put all of the engines onto every frame, so we cannot calculate the amount of time for which one particular drone is assembled.
Can he tell me a bit more about himself? What was he doing before the war?
До вторгнення я був баристою, там ще багато змінив робот.
Before the full-scale war, I used to have some odd jobs. I was a barista before the war. But when the war started, me and my girlfriend decided that we just could not just sit and wait for something, and we decided to act. There was another guy, we call him Uncle Sasha. He was 71 years old. He joined our team, and the three of us decided to deliver some medicals and food to the vulnerable groups of people in the region. We knew that there are some people who just cannot provide for themselves. So this is the reason why we decided to help them. And Ksenia was the person that I befriended with before the war, so we knew each other, and she stood behind this idea of drone production. So I just joined her, and this is how far we've come.
How do you enjoy drone making as opposed to flat white making?
Звичайно, виготовляти дрони, бо виготовляння flat white...
You know what? Of course I would choose drone production because making flat white is about doing a job, and making drones is bringing our victory closer.
І Після того, як ми почали співпрацювати з Ксенією.
Before drone production, we also used to help rebuild the Kharkiv region. So we managed to rebuild more than 400 roofs in the Kharkiv region. But then, we were sad that we could no longer go there since the hostilities were going on and it was not that useful. So we switched to something else that would be also helpful. This is why we decided to start making drones, because we had this desire to keep on helping, and this is basically the reason why we switched to this. Of course, even before drone production, we were buying drones, raising funds for them, but we realized that it was quite expensive. And when we started to produce them on our own, we started counting money, and it's really cheaper. It's way cheaper to produce a drone in Ukraine.
Хочемо допомагати, але
He was talking about how the drones was bringing Ukraine closer to victory. How does he feel about the conversation around negotiations at the moment?
Поки це не відбудеться, я хибних думок не створюю в своїй голові, тому що...
To be honest with you, I don't really think much about the politics, because right now my job is to help the guys at the front line. Before anything is implemented and before there is a conclusion or a decision made on that level, I don't want to think about this because it influences my focus. I don't want my focus to be shifted from the real help that I actually do for the guys on the front line.
Do you work here full time?
Ми, на жаль, травмувалися з початку вторгнення волонтерством, і зараз ми волонтери, які дозбираємо дрони.
So basically this volunteering is my current job. I'm 100% in this. I don't have any other job, and we live from the money that is sent to us from people's donations. Sometimes people just donate to support us so that we could afford at least anything. It's like our salaries, our very small salaries, but we just do this full time.
Початку вторгнення я перестав думати більше ніж на тиждень.
Now, since the full-scale invasion, I stopped thinking ahead, so I am not delusional. So I just plan for not more than 1 week ahead. So because, today you can be drinking some coffee, sitting in a cafe, and the next day you can be evacuating or be shelled by the Russians. So you never know what's going to happen. So, the realities of Ukraine today are quite harsh, and I am no longer thinking about my career or about purchasing my private estate. No, I'm not thinking about this. I'm thinking just about what is going to happen within the next several days.
As I leave the workshop, I'm really struck by how the war effort is made up of tiny operations like this one. If you're anything like me, and you've been lucky enough to live a life sheltered from war, what you imagine the war effort to be comes straight out of history books. It's black and white photographs of women flocking to huge factories. But here, the war effort is disseminated in the most mundane corners of the city. It's held together by the energy and entrepreneurship of people like Andrei and Sasha. They've gone from florist and barista to drone makers, and in such a short amount of time have gained an incredible level of skill and expertise. We've met a lot of people like them during our trip, beauticians turned explosive ordnance experts or producers who now rebuild houses. They've all put their lives on hold, they don't know what tomorrow is going to be made of, they have no regular income, and rely on the generosity of the world to keep their country going. Many times on this podcast, we've talked about the lack of weapons and resources on the front line. As it turns out, the ability to defeat an enemy as big as Russia falls on the shoulders of many Andrei and Sashas. It's an effort as remarkable as it is fragile. If you want to learn more about the workshop's operations, you can check out their website. It will be available in the show notes. And now to our final thoughts. Just a very quick one from me, since my first appearance in front of the mic in December, rather than working like a little mouse behind the scenes on the podcast documentaries, several listeners have reached out. And I'd like to thank one in particular. It's Ian from New York City. She has sent me some lovely gifts, a notebook, a pin of the Statue of Liberty to honour my French heritage. For those who don't know, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to the US to commemorate the Americans being finally freed from the Brits.
Steady on, Adélie, blimey.
We'll talk about that later, Francis. But the part I love the most is actually an incredible coincidence. It's a biro from the same brand I use as my fountain pen. And they just go wonderfully well together, just 2 different colours. Beautiful. Ian, you couldn't have known, but incredible intuition on your part. Thank you. Francis, over to you for your final thoughts.
Yes, I did. I just wanted to thank you very much for the replacement inkwell that you sent as well after the last one smashed in transit and led to our poor producer Ryan being covered in black ink. So thank you very much for resending that. You didn't have to. But for my final thought today, I wanted to return to Canada. We've had a listener write in, Pierre. Thank you, Pierre, for writing this. And he said as follows: "It was nice to hear you mention Canada in yesterday's podcast. One small correction. The election will almost certainly be called in March, when the Liberal government has to put a supply motion to the Parliament, so not in October, which is the latest date possible. Whilst there is lots of partisan political strife in the country, there is near unanimity of outrage, though, about Donald Trump's calling for Canada to join the US as the 51st state." And he goes on to say, Professor Timothy Snyder, of course a name very familiar to our listeners, has noted that this kind of rhetoric actually has echoes with what Putin has been saying. Trump's been talking about having Canada as the 51st state, Greenland, Panama, the Gulf of America, this kind of rhetoric, and how really it's unhelpful when the West is trying to act as a bastion of democratic values. And he says at the end, "At a time when the West faces an existential crisis with regards to Russia and its partners, we should be building unity, not creating needless fights and division." So thank you very much, Pierre, for writing in, and of course to everybody who's contributed on the subjects we've discussed this week.
Dom, over to you for your final thoughts.
Thanks, Adélie. And I'll say don't worry about being baffled by drone warfare. It'll all become clear. Ask Francis how he arrives at his fashion choices, then you'll be really baffled. But anyway, for my final thoughts, I'm going to go to Serbia, and thanks to Nenad, and I apologise if I've mispronounced your name, but we've been corresponding recently on the subject of the frozen Russian assets and being able to leverage them to get money for Ukraine. Now, Nenad said to me, whenever you touch on the topic of why there is a lack of willingness to use the $300 billion of Russian reserves for Ukraine, you state that it's a legal issue or that there's fear that no one's money will be safe anymore. But don't you think it's simply that there's no will to do so, as most Western countries believe there's a very real chance Ukraine could lose the war, in which case they, meaning their taxpayers, would have to repay the money? Thank you for that, Nina. But so I simply don't know is a simple answer. I'm not an economist, studied economics at A-level and that's about it, and that was a long time ago. But I just think even if Russia wins the war, I don't think Western countries would pay back the interest from these frozen assets. I imagine there'd be some sort of claim put in by the Western countries for all the displaced Ukrainians and damage, etc. They maybe even made a case made for compensating for the reduction in the global grain trade. I just don't know. I just can't see, even if there was a Russian victory, I can't see the West going, yeah, tell you what, we'll give all the money back. I don't really see it. But as I say, I'm not an expert. I imagine there would be calls for some settlement from the likes of Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, and those kind of characters. I don't know. Just to recap on the frozen Russian assets, there's consideration given that some countries are reluctant to try and leverage that for money for Ukraine because it would set a very damaging international precedent. But I genuinely don't know. I'd be willing to take anyone's comments on this and let's have a look and see if we can get to the bottom of it.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine, the latest, as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine, the latest, on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. And please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.